Eugene Haywood was just 15 when he sold his first crack rock on the streets of Peoria, Illinois.
Started dealing just to buy shoes and clothes and things like that, so when I went to school, I wouldn't be made fun of.
Haywood wasn't some drug kingpin, but he had the misfortune of being prosecuted at the height of the tough-on-crime era.
They used 2 prior charges that I had to enhance me up to a mandatory life sentence.
It was 2002, 3 decades after President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse America's public enemy #1.
In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
This summer marks the 50th anniversary of the so-called war on drugs. But time has shown that in many ways, that campaign was essentially a war on people who looked like Haywood.
They incarcerated poor people. They incarcerated folks of color. They incarcerated Black people. That's what they set out to do, and that is what they did.
An Associated Press analysis found that between 1970 and 2000, the incarceration rates for the Black and Latino populations roughly tripled, while only slightly more than doubling for whites. What started under Nixon intensified with Ronald Reagan. His First Lady, Nancy, made an emotional appeal to the nation's youth.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
Meanwhile, the 1986 Anti-Abuse Act ushered in mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses and infamously made penalties for the possession and sale of crack harsher than for powder cocaine.
Like, our kids are struggling. Help us, help us, help us. They didn't ask for tanks.
Alton Lucas is an example of what might have happened had the system been designed to help people instead of waging war on them. The Durham, North Carolina native had offers to play college basketball, but then someone offered him a joint laced with crack, and his life turned upside down.
It confused my brain. It took away all of my priorities instantly.
He became addicted and began dealing to support his habit, then stealing to fund his dealing. Lucas was in the process of robbing this store when the man behind the counter pointed a pistol at him.
He didn't pull the trigger.
He turned himself in. Lucas was facing years behind bars, but the judge agreed to a reduced sentence if Lucas successfully completed a drug rehabilitation program. At 54, he is happily married with 3 children. And best of all,
I've been sober now almost 30 years.
His felony record still haunts him, but a program called Inmates to Entrepreneurs has helped him grow his landscaping business. Lucas knows he's one of the lucky ones.
Just how many lives that were lost.
Good afternoon, everybody.
But in 2015, President Barack Obama took what he called another step forward in upholding the nation's fundamental ideals of justice and fairness.
Today I commuted the sentences of 95 men and women who had served their debt to society.
Eugene Haywood was one of them. He was released in January 2016 after serving 14 years. He moved to Texas to avoid falling in with old friends and into old habits.
I didn't want to prove Obama wrong.
Viewing it from the inside, Haywood says prosecutors have waged the war on drugs all wrong.
I don't see a visible winner in the war on drugs.
And the cycle continues. Last year, Haywood's only son was convicted of federal murder, racketeering, and conspiracy in connection with a drug gang back in Peoria. Eugene Haywood Jr. is now serving life plus 10 years. Alan Breed, Associated Press, Durham, North Carolina.
And we are back, folks, here on WLTH 1370 AM. So, Rev, it's the 50-year anniversary of the war on drugs. 50 years ago exactly, President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs.
Wow.
Yes, and I think it's safe that we can say that the winner of the war on drugs has been drugs.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yes.
You know, it's funny because it's not like there has been a time in United States history when there weren't chemical substances being used by people
right
for clear purposes and not clear purposes. And by not clear purposes, I mean there were times when certain chemicals would be sold as curatives.
Yeah, like cocaine.
Yeah.
And heroin.
Yeah. And so people were buying them for curative purposes as well as to, you know, become comfortably numb.
Yeah.
But the thing is, on the one hand, yes, the move that they made, starting with Nixon and so on through the various other presidents, was harsh and punitive. But here in many local communities, we were dealing with the impact of the drug business.
Yep.
And the drug business, just like the alcohol business during Prohibition, was not a benevolent business.
Definitely not.
Like that one young man who was on the verge of an athletic career, and someone gave him a marijuana joint laced with crack. Now, whoever did that to him knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Knew that this young man had a future, and whoever that was made a callous decision to upend his future to get another customer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure that there's somebody that's related to whoever that nameless person is that would be ready to jump up and down and tell us what a nice guy he was, what a wonderful guy he was, what a good son he was. But on that night, he chose to take steps to ruin another man's life for a piece of change.
Yeah. The demonic, that right there is, people talk about the demonic spirit. That's a demonic spirit, knowing that you essentially hooking somebody. I remember being, growing up during the 80s and 90s, when being a little kid during that time period, especially up to the, say, mid 90s or so, being a really small kid. And they used to, they really did their best to scare the hell out of us. They used to tell us that even if they took the pleasure centers out of your brain, removed it, you would still crave crack if you ever smoked it.
Mm-hmm.
We used to believe that crackheads had superhuman strength and superhuman speed. And, like seriously, you hear stories about crackheads outrunning Carl Lewis, and just the sheer height of the media coverage, which had a lot to do with it. And you had a lot of our politicians, including our current president, Joe Biden, who really seized upon that. Now we know now that his son Hunter is a crack smoker. They just found his computer last year.
Oh, really?
Yes, they found his laptop with all the pictures of him smoking crack and doing all kind of lewd sexual things on it. His daughter, a lot of people don't know his daughter also. His daughter also was somebody who had a drug problem. The New York Post actually, or the New York Times, had footage of his daughter snorting coke, but they suppressed it. Now, all the time that this was happening, this is what Joe Biden was saying. Now, mind you, this is
I had spent years writing what became known as the Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
The Biden crime bill. Democrats right now, especially African Americans, have really looked back on the 1994 crime bill not very fondly. Hillary Clinton herself has come out against it, even though her husband signed it into law. Well, the author of that crime bill was Joe Biden.
The Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
Biden's 1994 crime bill, while implementing sweeping gun control, also helped fuel mass incarceration with financial incentives to keep people behind bars.
The Biden crime bill. The Biden crime bill.
The Biden crime bill is before us, calls for the death penalty for 51 offenses. A wag in the newspaper recently wrote that something to the effect that Biden has made it a death penalty offense for everything but jaywalking.
Now, see, like I said, mind you, his children were doing all of this, and he, even during the 80s, he helped his son Hunter get out of a crack conviction on the Jersey Shore. They said in Atlantic City.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
So, because I was willing to say, okay, well, his kids were probably kids then, so.
No, Hunter's 50 years old.
Is he that old?
Yeah, Hunter's 50. Hunter's 50 years old. His daughter's got to be close to 50 as well. Remember, Joe Biden's 80.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
He's 80 years old.
Yeah.
Yes. So, they all seized on the opportunity to look at, the state that was happening in our community and criminalize it, starting with Nixon, then Reagan, then Clinton. And, that was one of the things that really annoyed me last year when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who herself was a drug warrior, ran in San Francisco as somebody who's going to be, much harder on crime than her alternatives, and locking up truant the parents of truant children and things like that.
I've had that conversation before.
Yes, we have. But see, the funny thing is that these people are the people who, because we have our media is owned by a few people, they're able to convince the black community that somehow that they are not part of the racist system that mass incarcerates black people. Even though, again, that video goes on for another 8 minutes. I can just play Joe Biden talking about throwing people in prison all day.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The thing is, during that time period, we were feeling the brunt of the scourge of the drugs.
Right.
So yes, we supported 3 strikes sentencing in many urban communities because we were being gutted by this stuff.
Yeah.
If you're sitting there drowning and somebody throws something in the water, you're gonna grab it because you're drowning. And that's what we were. And since nobody was saying anything about, well, we're going to push a ton of money into rehabilitation. And yes, it's also true, even if you get somebody in rehabilitation, they have to want to be rehabilitated. And I had friends and relationships with people who got caught up in that thing. And I'm going to tell you something. That was one nasty drug.
Oh yes, it was.
It was nasty. I saw where people would lie to their own spouses, would deprive their own children of things. And it's not that they didn't care, it's that thing had them by the throat.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to a person one time and asking him, what is it about this stuff? And he said to me, he goes, well, the first time you do it, it's like nothing you've ever experienced. And then you spend the rest of your days trying to catch that first one. Trying to catch that first high.
You're right. And the sad thing is that after 50 years, as I said, the drugs have won the war on drugs. Yeah. I think that's pretty obvious. And last week we covered that we had a record 93,000 people die of overdose deaths. Now, here's the difference between when people die from the drugs from the street level criminals, like in our community, and when people die from the corporations giving them drugs. Because, this other story that I want to talk about related to the war on drugs relates to us here in the state of Indiana.
Right.
Because our state is going to get $507 million as a part of a multi-state agreement to settle a lawsuit against opiate distributors designed to bring relief to people struggling with drug addiction. Now, our Attorney General, Todd Rokita, the same guy we're going to talk about in the next segment, who's talking about critical race theory, our Attorney General said the settlement marks a step forward in efforts to end the opioid epidemic. Now, according to the AG's office, the $26 billion multi-state settlement could resolve the claims of both state and local governments across the country, including Indiana's lawsuit against Cardinal Health, McKesson, and AmerisourceBergen. The deal also calls for Johnson & Johnson to pay up to $5 billion, in addition to billions more from the major national drug distribution companies. AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health each contributed $6.4 billion, and McKesson to pay $8 billion. Now, see, here's the thing. Now, this is a drop in the bucket for those corporations. Nobody's going to jail behind this. So the families actually wanted the Sackler family, who owned Purdue Pharma. They wanted them to be harshly punished because their settlement, because they're the ones who make OxyContin. Okay, that's the drug that really started this pain epidemic. Now they knew what their drug was doing, and they knew that there were pain pill factories all over America that they were pushing to these very, I don't know what you want to call them, these doctors with loose morals.
Right.
Now they've agreed to release millions of documents, and they will also contribute $50 million. Not 50 billion, 50 million. And critics have hoped to see the Sackler family more severely punished for their role in the nation's opioid crisis, which has killed 500,000 Americans in the past 20 years. 500,000. That's far more than crack ever killed. Okay.
Ooh-wee.
Now here's the funny thing. The most hilarious part of the the Sackler family's settlement is that as a part of their settlement, the Sackler family has promised not to lend its name to any museums for the next 9 years.
What is?
Meaning, you know how rich people like to buy music.
Yeah.
So they can't do that for the next 9 years. Now nobody's going to jail. Just like, you know, Pookie or Ray Ray would go to jail if they were selling heroin to people.
Right.
That was killing people. They're not going to go to jail. They're just going to pay a few $1 billion of their fortune, and they can't have any museums or art.
They can't have a building with their name on.
Yeah, they can't have a building with their name on.
Well, you know, when you're at the level they are, you can buy everything.
Yeah.
You can buy anything you want. So the only thing left to do is buy some good press, or, you know, you buy your legacy.
Right.
And that's what they do. They invest in their legacy.
Right. And so this is the unfair thing that has always happened with the war on drugs in this country. We knew Wall Street. I know you probably heard before because it became a story that Wall Street had a big major cocaine problem during a lot of the time period that they were acting recklessly, and it makes a lot of sense as to why Wall Street, these sort of Wall Street traders who are up all night, they're obsessed with making these minor transactions and doing God knows what else. Like if you've ever watched Wolf of Wall Street or the movie Wall Street with Charlie Sheen, you'll see that a lot of what these guys do in their personal lives, from strippers and porn stars and to drugs and orgies and all these other things, these people are doing this while they're making these these horribly reckless transactions that ends up wrecking the economy. It wrecked the economy in the late 80s. They had the stock crash in 1987. Then in 2008, they did the same thing. So what we have is what we always have. We have the poor people in the inner city who are usually black, sometimes brown. They're the ones who get to die in the streets. Okay, they're the ones who are the soldiers for these drug cartels, you know, Mexican drug cartels, the Hispanics. For us, the black street gangs like the Bloods, the Crips, the Gangster Disciples, the Vice Lords. What you see in Chicago, 100 people get shot every week in Chicago. That's what that's about. Okay, these people have been battling over territory for generations now. You know, Richard Nixon tore down all the projects in Chicago where the gangs had their territories where they could sell their drugs. And then he forced all the people together so he could try to get the Olympics. They didn't even get the Olympics, folks. They didn't even get the Olympics. So they tore down all those neighborhoods for nothing and forced groups of people together who shouldn't have been together, which drove the reinvigoration of crime.